The Daily Read. Your source for news, politics, sports, and all things trending. Here's your host, Marcus Gentry.
There are over 1 million people of African descent in Germany. But what is life like for black individuals in the capital city, Berlin?
Something racist might happen, where then someone who's with me or someone who's observing it will stick up for me a lot more here than they would in the United States.
When I moved to Berlin, I come out and I look and say, wow, Berlin is so big, where are the black people, man?
I do get asked often, where am I from? I am never asked, as I was asked in the US, what am I?
My generation is pretty much the first generation, so we are actually there.
Welcome to the Daily Read, and I am your host, Marcus Gentry. Today, we're going to start a new show. We still have the Daily Read, of course, but we're going to start Black Underneath. It's going to be my new docuseries where we talk about the black folks all around the world, because slaves just didn't come to America only. They took slaves and they spread them out all over the world. And a lot of these people survived like us. You know, we don't hear these stories because we're caught up in an American thing of fighting bigotry and inequality and things of that nature. But I like to see things like this, because I like to bring to you things that interest me. It might interest you. You never know. If this is a type of tea you like, drink it. If you don't like it, throw it out. I'm cool with it. But we finna get into it. This is Black Underneath, the story of the black Germans.
We see being German as something defined by skin color. Being German means being white, and those who aren't white are essentially newcomers and don't have the same right to be part of society as white people.
Wie weiße Menschen.
I was born in Germany. I'm a German native speaker. I've been to Africa once in my life as part of a package tour.
If you notice, this guy right here, he looks like, you know, somebody's cousin down the street. Many of these Germans, and they are Germans, people, make no mistake about it, they Germans. But many of these people, I don't think even speak English. And they have a rich history like us here in America, that they're still fighting for rights and things of that nature. Like I said, let's get back into it. I love watching docuseries like this.
It doesn't get more German than that.
People will of course ask me where I come from, and I say, from Cottbus. And your mother? I'll say, also from Cottbus. Does that answer your question, or do you still need that little piece of the puzzle that explains why I look the way I do?
In Britain they say,
we are here because you were there.
we're here because...
I'm gonna stop that right there. She looks like she from Mississippi. Seriously, look at her. She can barely speak English.
You were there. I think that's a very important part of the answer. Society here must take responsibility for what happened in its history.
Für das, was in der Geschichte passiert ist.
This is exactly the right moment to look at black German history and how it's always been a part of German history, an important part.
like some of our old baby pictures.
Abena Adomako's family is in its 5th generation in Germany.
These lovely old photos. You see here a typical old German household with wood paneling and fabric wallpaper. You can't get a better snapshot of German life than that.
In 1896, her great-grandfather Mandenga Dieck became the first African to acquire German citizenship in Hamburg.
Amazing.
I'm gonna stop that right there. 5 generations, people. That means her family has been living in Germany before Hitler came to power. Think about that. Her family has been in Germany since before Hitler became a dictator. That means they survived the concentration camps, the bombings, the liberation of the concentration camps. And you never hear about this stuff. You hear about the Jews and the things that they suffered, but you never hear about them. Let's continue on.
That pride. He was known to be very loyal to the emperor and very German. My family has a long history on its back, as it were, which means having experienced or having survived a lot. And the survival part is especially important, as is the fact that even back then they fought for their humanity to be recognized.
At what became known as the Berlin West Africa Conference in 1884, the European powers carved up the continent among themselves, without African participation. Germany then also became a colonial power, ruling over Togo, Cameroon, German East Africa, and German Southwest Africa. Even before the 19th century, Germans had been profiting from the slave trade. Now, colonists seized entire territories, culminating in a genocide in Namibia in 1904. Meanwhile, growing numbers of Africans were arriving in Germany. Robbie Aitken is a British historian who researches the history of black Europeans.
The colonial period is important for the emergence of a black community because it was the first time that hundreds, if not thousands, of black people were able to come to Germany.
Notice, people, how he says, come to Germany. But they came to Germany in 2 ways. The first way was as slaves, just like we came to America. But you got to realize this, that a lot of European countries released their slaves decades or years before America had the Civil War. I think Abraham Lincoln, if I'm correct, if I remember correctly, asked Europe what should he do about the Civil War. I read an article somewhere, I think it was talking about how Abraham Lincoln got the idea to fight the South. Europeans told him to release the slaves, which sparked something in him to do that, because you know, a lot of people give him credit for emancipation and all of that, but like I said, he was fighting a war, and the South would have been able to use, just like slave labor, they would have been able to use the black slaves as foot soldiers. So by him releasing the black slaves in the South, You know, it started a lot of uprisings. It started a lot of defections. It started a lot of people leaving the plantations and running off and joining the military in the North. And you still had blacks fighting on the Confederate side. But Abraham Lincoln, he really got that idea of releasing the slaves from the Europeans, because like I said, the Europeans ended slavery years before America did. Let's continue on.
They came for many different reasons. 700 people, for instance, were brought over for the human zoos that toured Germany or across Europe.
From their first appearance in the 1870s, these ethnological expositions proved extremely popular with the European public. At the Hanover Zoo in 1913, Ethiopians were hired as contract workers. They were put on display, often with their families. Visitors paid an entrance fee to see them. As colonists were committing genocide in Africa, back home in Germany, the middle class were being won over to the so-called colonial adventure.
This exoticization, romanticization, this idea of, let's take the family to the zoo, like we know today. But instead of looking at animals, we get to see exotic people. Except these people weren't representing their own culture or communities. It was a staged spectacle and had nothing to do with who they actually were.
Stage spectacles. Let's talk about that. You know, Africans had their own cultures, but to make the ticket sales, some of the white Germans staged a lot of the African traits, painting on their faces, stuff that they probably never even did in Africa. And then maybe they did bring some of their traits and things that they did in Africa with them, but to make a spectacle, the Germans added a little extra. It's almost like when you in the movie theater and you see Jackie Chan doing some crazy, amazing stunts, but you know, it's staged. That don't mean he can't fight. That don't mean he don't know kung fu. But some of the stuff that he does in his movies is over exaggerated. Let's continue on.
The first state-organized colonial exhibition in Germany took place in 1896 in Berlin. 106 men, women, and children were brought in from German colonies. Photographs show how people were racially degraded and forced to be exhibited.
The colonial authorities wanted to portray Africans as less civilized, as primitive. They wanted to use this image to legitimize Germany's colonial project, their civilizing mission. The Germans bringing culture and civilization to Africans.
This ought to be a treat for the Afrocentric people out there. When the man said that was Germans' way of bringing culture and civilization to the African people, but you know, like all your Afrocentric people, like Dr. Umar say, we already had culture and civilization there.
Berlin was the capital of an overseas empire. The colonial administration needed craftsmen, translators, and other specialized personnel. Young Africans were brought over to Germany for training, most of them men, and drawn from the African elite. Some were still just school children. Their parents paid considerable sums for their education. The new arrivals called one another compatriots. but they were not foreseen as a permanent part of German society. In 1891, Mandenga Dijk traveled to Hamburg from Douala, Cameroon. He came from a wealthy family and could already speak German. He then completed an apprenticeship as a shoemaker.
He was expected to demonstrate his shoemaking skills in the big shop window. That made him feel like he too was on display, which made him feel very uncomfortable. So in the end, he changed his profession and became a merchant.
While traveling on business, Dijk met a woman called Emilia. Interracial marriages were banned in the colonies for reasons rooted in racist ideology. But in Gdansk, then Danzig in Prussia, the couple married and had 2 daughters, Erika and Doris. A highly respected Afro-German family, they ran a store selling tobacco and other colonial goods. The lives of black people in Germany were of little interest to most historians until Katharina Oguntoya's work appeared. She was the first to research the stories of Afro-Germans, including that of Mandenga Dijk.
I was astonished to discover that he was granted citizenship. I suppose it was so early on that there weren't yet objections from the colonial administration. Most of the people who applied later were rejected.
Now, what she mean by later, this is right around the time Adolf Hitler was coming into power. Now, remember, these people have been in Germany for 5 generations. And Hitler and his party were the ones who started all the racial hatred with the Jews. And from what I'm gathering about this story, they included the minorities, the blacks, in it. But you don't hear about these stories. Let's continue on.
After the First World War, German imperialist expansion was brought to an end, at least for the time being. The Treaty of Versailles resulted in Germany ceding its colonies. At the same time, French troops occupied the Rhineland. Among their ranks were African soldiers, which German nationalists saw as a humiliation. They launched a racist smear campaign, calling it the Black Shame. That propaganda in turn fueled racism against all black people across Germany into a far more dangerous form. But from the very start, there was resistance. In 1919, Germany's first black train driver, Martin de Boba, and other people of African descent listed their demands in a historic petition.
He was part of the anti-colonial resistance, which had always been there. There was never a time when black people didn't fight back or stand up for their rights.
Natasha,
I want to say something about that real quick. That man's story sounds almost similar to Martin Luther King Jr.'s story. Remember, he died going to Memphis to protest about the bus drivers. It was something going on with the pay and the inequality with the bus drivers in Memphis. And this is almost similar. But like I said, we never hear about these stories. Let's continue on.
A. Kelly is a scholar and activist who has documented the lives of people who brought about change in black German history. Although Martin de Boba had sworn allegiance to the Weimar Republic, he wanted to achieve something new with the petition: equal rights for black people. 18 Africans living in Germany signed the petition to the German parliament.
They wanted young Africans to have the opportunity to attend university or college. They wanted, probably for personal reasons too, the recognition and legitimization of marriages between black men and white women. And they also wanted a permanent representative in the parliament, Martin de Bobe to be precise.
The petition failed, but it marked the dawn of the first black movement in Germany. Mandenga Dijk was one of the men who signed his name. Today, those events are remembered on a commemorative pillar in downtown Berlin.
That's my great-granddad. I think it's fantastic, historical. It's such a good feeling to know that my great-grandfather was also part of the fight.
As the Roaring '20s hit Germany, black American dancer Josephine Baker became a celebrated figure on the stages of Berlin.
I always call it the grass skirt era. A black man had to walk around wearing a grass skirt, not a suit.
Born in Berlin in 1925, Theodor Vanya Michael was one of the few surviving black witnesses of the Nazi era, until his death in 2019. As a child, he was put to work in the circus and in the so-called human zoos. He hated being gawked at, or when complete strangers would run their fingers through his hair.
I want y'all to look at these people. They don't look nothing like the Africans of that era looked. Like I said, this stuff was staged. These people look like a cross between Native Americans and what white people would think Africans would look like. You got to remember, these people were actually born, some of these people were born in Germany. Like the man that just passed away in 2019, he was born in Germany, but they put him in the circus anyway. So he probably never even knew how Africans actually looked and acted. This is crazy. Let's continue on.
Things got even worse with the introduction of the notorious Nuremberg race laws in 1935. Colonial migrants were stripped of their citizenship. Theodor Vanya Michael was issued an alien's passport and was rendered stateless. He lost his job at a hotel. Finding work became nearly impossible. One of the few exceptions was a niche market, the movies. The most expensive film of the Nazi era, Munchausen, required many black extras to play servants in a Turkish palace. The roles conformed to degrading stereotypes.
I gotta say something about this too. Hold on. I don't know how many of you were born in the 60s and 70s, but I can remember Munchausen. It was a German comedy because I was a big fan of the Three Stooges. And for some of y'all that was born in Chicago or Indiana back in the 70s and lived up there in the 70s and 80s, you probably could remember it was Monty Python, it was the Marx Brothers, it was the Three Stooges, and then they would play some type of comedy movie real late at night, you would have to stay up to like 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning to see this stuff. And Benny Hill, I forgot about Benny Hill. Benny Hill was funny. You know, I think that was the first time I ever saw boobs. Let's get it.
That furthered the Nazis' racist ideology. The young Theodor Vanya Michael played the Sultan's fanning boy. Only later did he realize he'd been exploited.
Unterdrückt in dem Sinne, als ich nie.
Exploited in the sense that I never played a positive role.
Durchaus positive.
I was only ever decoration. They needed exotic people.
Man brauchte die Exoten.
They needed us, and today we know we were exploited.
Dass man missbraucht wurde.
The notion of white supremacy was celebrated in many Nazi colonial films. The regime had plans to reconquer former overseas colonies. Quacks in Africa was one of many films to degrade black people and use overtly racist dialogue.
And I want to go back to that Munchausen show. It was played in America. Understand what I'm saying, people. It was exploitive, and he was exploited. But all the way in America, years after the movie was made, American television played it, because I can remember seeing Munchausen. But America treated it as a comedy because it had funny slapstick humor in places. And this goes to show you that real people, real lives, all the way across the sea, all the way across the ocean, was being exploited to make this movie. And you know, that just, it's just a little tidbit of history. It's how can you call it, when you realize something that can be devastating like that to someone else, that you actually had a laugh off of. Let's continue on.
In this clip, the protagonist gestures to the people approaching and says he's seen them before, quote, at the Berlin Zoo. Afro-German actors were routinely cast in such roles. The medicine man was played by Louis Brody, the grandfather of Abena Adomako.
My family and a large number of African people here only survived the Nazi era because they were needed for these German colonial films.
Wow.
From 1939 onwards, daily life became increasingly dangerous for black people. The Deeks were among many families who lost their home and had their passports revoked. Mandenga Deeks' business went bankrupt. Interracial couples faced persecution. Around 400 children fathered by black French occupying troops were forcibly sterilized. Many black people were forced to go into hiding. At least 2,000 were killed in concentration camps. The Afro-German community was being eradicated by the Nazis.
The aim was to ensure that there wouldn't be another generation of black people in Germany. And more importantly, that there would be no black Europeans.
Wow. That's some devastating stuff. That's devastating. Can you imagine your wife or you being forced into sterilization? That's deep. That's deep. We're going to get into this first commercial break, and when we get back, we'll go back into it.
The business, motherfucker. The Daily Read.
Might have seen these stumbling stones around Berlin. Each one represents a victim of the Nazis who lived or worked at this address. But only a few remember black victims. When the Nazis came to power, thousands of black residents lived in Germany. Suddenly, they were barred from universities, lost their jobs, or had their citizenship revoked. Many were harassed and even killed. Last year, plaques were added in remembrance of 2 black victims who were killed just miles from their Berlin homes. There are believed to be many more Afro-German victims, but finding documentation remains difficult. Many hope to see more plaques dedicated to these often overlooked victims of the Nazis.
Welcome back to the Daily Read, and I am your host, Marcus Gentry. Today is the first show of my docuseries, Black Underneath, and we're going to be talking about black African slaves who were transferred and moved to other places in the world, not just America. And of course, we already know about the Afro-Latinas, the Filipino blacks. We're gonna do a docuseries on all of it, because this is good, not just to know our history, but we minorities, we went through it all over the world, and in some places we still going through it. Let's get back into this. This right here is I want to get to her story. She's a senator, I think.
The first Afro-German deputy speaker of a regional parliament. 3 years later, she became the first black state minister.
From an early age,
she looked mean as hell. She looked like my niece. She looked like she finna tear something up.
you're reminded of the fact that you don't look like everyone around you. Adults especially make you feel that. They're itching to know where you're from. You're 6 or 7 years old and think, I live here. And you don't ask yourself all these questions about identity or ancestry.
Aminata Touré was born in refugee housing after her parents fled Mali in 1992. At the age of 12, she became a German citizen. As a student leader, she showed an early commitment to combating discrimination. Today, as a politician in the Schleswig-Holstein State Parliament, she tackles structural racism in public institutions and society.
Tell us about your racist experiences, I'm often asked. And usually I have absolutely no desire to do so, for 2 reasons. Firstly, because many believe that these experiences are individual. They start to excuse it and tell me they're coincidences that have been piling up for 26 years. I've heard it so often. Miss Touré, you're always talking about racism, but you yourself have made it to deputy speaker. And I think, what does that have to do with the fact that at this very moment, someone somewhere is probably having problems with immigration authorities or being racially abused on the street? This pretending that these issues are all fixed just because you have some individual figurehead is very problematic.
Today, 1/5 of all Germans have migration backgrounds. Aminata Touré encourages minorities to become politically active.
I think we should do that here in America too. Rearing our kids up to be senators and congressmen. Of course, we already have minorities, Hispanic and black, that are senators and congressmen, but not enough. Because when you look in these state houses all across the country, you still see majority whites. Most of us blacks, when we get into politics, we go for the big dogs. We go for the big positions, Congress or senator. But politics, okay, I can be harsh sometimes on other levels, but when I'm talking about politics, I'm gonna try to be precise as I can. When you're dealing with politics, everything is on the ground level. The mayors, the city councils, the governors, the lieutenant governors, those positions are a lot of times overlooked by us minorities. And you have certain places like Illinois that does have a large population of black local governance. But then they call her the city girl mayor of one of the little towns outside of Chicago. She's corrupt. She's spending money hand over fist for 5 or 6 male security guards to walk around with her, you know, like she's the big boss. I mean, it's just I'm not going to talk about her right now. We're talking about the black Germans. But I just wanted to stop that and say that more of us need to push our kids instead of a football or a basketball, push them into politics.
At the heart of the issue is the question of who's allowed to be part of society, and what does it actually mean to be German? In the words of Afro-German poet Mai Aim, who instead of asking questions simply states, "I will still be African, even if you want me to be German. And I will be German, even if my blackness does not suit you. I will go yet another step further, to the very edge, where my sisters and brothers stand, where our freedom begins. I will go yet another step further, and another, and will return when I want, how I want, borderless and brazen."
You can tell she's a proud German. You can tell she's a proud German just by the tone in which she said that. She's a very proud German. There's another story I wanted to get to. This guy right here. He's one of Germany's top rappers. And he looks so much different from the rappers of America. Let's get to his story.
I mean, I always had a lot of friends, but I do remember in kindergarten that we played these funny games like Who's Afraid of the Black Man and 10 Little Negroes, it's called in German. So, and I remember that sometimes...
Can you imagine that? These photos of her look like 80s photos. Can you imagine in the 80s? Because if you were born in the 60s or 70s, you started going to school in the 80s, okay? And right around that time, we was busting white kids' heads for saying nigger. We would bust their heads. So her photographs look like they were around the 80s, the mid to late 80s. And can you imagine kids in America playing a game like Who's Afraid of the Black Man? This is crazy.
They ran after me and said, Jana Afrikaner. It means something like Jana is an African, Jana is an African. And the problem is that African meant something bad.
And she wanted to be white at one time.
I first met Sammy Deluxe when I was a teenager in Hamburg. Today he's one of Germany's most successful rappers and hip-hop artists.
Achso, ja? Das Ding ist aber so ein Umsonst-Ding eigentlich. Ja, ein paar Wochen letztes.
I've come to see Sammy in a studio. He's had a number of top 10 hits and has sold over 1 million recordings. Today he also produces other musicians. As a kid I wanted to be white, and you?
Kennst du das?
Yeah, as a kid white, and as a teenager I really wanted to be black.
Me too.
To not have this ambiguity, it seemed so clear-cut, like on the white side. White people just knew who they were, black people did too. I felt like I was in the middle. I grew up in a white family, in a white neighborhood. It was definitely a challenge.
Eine Challenge auf jeden Fall.
For me, the feeling of being caught in between is something imposed on you from the outside. I mean, people always say, don't you feel torn, two cultures, black and white, which do you feel more a part of? The fact is, you yourself don't find it unusual. Why should I have to choose?
One thing that caused me a fair amount of confusion right from the start was that I have straight hair.
So, und das bei mir dann immer so war, wenn mich in der Grundschule oder so irgendwelche Kids Neger genannt haben und ich dann...
In grade school, if some kid called me the N-word and I reacted defensively or aggressively, they'd say, hey, you're not really a nigger because your hair is straight. So for me, that was like, okay, I'm dark enough to get called the N-word, but my hair isn't frizzy or curly enough for me to have the right to get upset about it? That was the first contradiction that was imposed on me from the outside.
You wrote a song for your son about heroes, didn't you?
Den Song habe ich geschrieben 2008.
I wrote the song in 2008. At the time, I was reading a Harry Potter book to my son in the evening at bedtime, and one night he said he wished he were white, because then he could be like his friends. And all he'd have to do is paint that thing on his forehead and wear round glasses, and he'd look like Harry Potter. That made me realize that there's an acute shortage of dark-skinned superheroes. So I wrote this song and made a really nice video to go along with it.
Auch ein sehr schönes Video dazu gedreht. Ein Superheld mit brauner Haut.
Ich weiß noch, dass ich... I can remember when I was 13, I was into Nirvana, and that's when I started going to parties. And the other kids would say, huh?
Let me stop there right there. Nirvana is one of the greatest rock bands of all time. Period.
Oh, Nirvana, you're black. Why are you listening to that? You should be listening to black music. I did, and I liked it more. And then there was the black music scene, whatever that means, hip-hop and R&B.
Nirvana's cool.
And then all of a sudden you as a black person were part of the majority. And there were these positive associations.
Ja, das hat, also ich glaube, das war auch für mich ein großer...
I think that's one of the main reasons I became who I am.
Weil das Rap-Ding das erste war.
Rap was the first thing that gave me a home court advantage, so to speak. I just had to let my pants hang a little bit lower, pull my cap to the side, and move like this. And everyone was into it. It looked authentic, and it fit well with my exotic status. I did graffiti, DJing, collected records, started producing, rapping, and beatboxing. All the hip-hop disciplines except breakdancing. That was too much work.
So you're telling me you're not the sporty type?
Only with words.
As a journalist, I don't have a home court advantage. When I decided to become a journalist and when I became an anchor, I was actually, I think, the first female black anchor in Germany. I didn't have any role models. Hier sind die Nachrichten der DW aus Berlin. Herzlich willkommen. For me, it's really important that black children, you know, when they switch on the TV, they might see me and think, oh, great, I can be on TV and read the news. And I don't have to have a job which fulfills the racist stereotypes. For me, that would be great if I could help bring down barriers in that sense. Black people have been living in Germany for 400 years. Today, they number about 1 million. In Cologne, I've come to see Theodor Wonja Michael. He was born in 1925 in Berlin. Why did your father come from Cameroon to Germany back then?
Cameroon was a German colony. And just as people used to dream of going to America.
I want to stop that,
right
time,
many young...
Look at them people. Look at them. At this time, I think we was just really coming out of slavery, and Jim Crow was in full swing. This man is walking around with a white wife in Europe. My mother went over to Germany with her husband and she told us that, you know, they love black people over there now. But this is why. I talked about this on one of my shows about how if we would have cut the head off the snake, we might not have as much racism as we have today. And what I mean by cutting the head off the snake, we never did away with the Confederate leaders, because Lincoln didn't want to cause an uproar in the South. We beat the South. We locked them up for a few months, a few years, and then we sent them home after they promised never to get back into politics or raise arms against the United States again. Most of those people should have been hung. If they would have been hung or locked away for life, and I know this sounds harsh, but if they would have been hung and locked away for life, they wouldn't have been able to preach the hatred to their kids and go on down the line. Like I said, it wouldn't have eliminated all the racism in America, but we might not have had the rise of somebody like Donald Trump. We might not have had the craziness that went on at the Capitol with the insurrection. Racism is always going to be in the world. That's just because people are going to always look at the opposite shade of your skin, whether you white looking at white, or black looking at white, or white looking at black, or black looking at brown, Latinos. You're always going to have some form of bigotry. But I don't think it would have been as great if we would have did away permanently with the leaders of the Confederacy. Let's continue on.
Africans wanted to come to Germany. There was no such thing as what we now call racism. At least not as we know it today. It only started to take shape when the young Africans started asserting themselves. For instance, by marrying German women. And the reaction was, they're taking away our women.
So nach dem Prinzip, die nehmen uns ja die Frauen weg.
You appeared in ethnographic exhibits, also known as human zoos. What was that like?
Imagine human beings being exhibited like objects, literally exhibited, for what they supposedly represented, namely Africa, with vast skirts, drums, dancing, and songs. The idea was that people on display were foreign, exotic, and were showing spectators what their homeland was like. Basically, it was just a big show.
Zeigen uns, wie ihre Heimat ist. Im Grunde genommen war das Show.
How crazy is that? You as a German were supposed to imitate this perceived culture of Africa, which is such a huge continent.
Didn't I say that? Those people were put on display as what Africa was looking like. And all of them blacks in that photo, all of them blacks in this photo right here were Germans. They don't even look like what African it looked like they found a German robe, somebody's house robe. They went and got an old African shield somewhere. You know, all of these people in this photo are Germans, black Germans. That's crazy. That's crazy. Let's continue on.
Films made back then. And many of us would meet up as part of the cast. That's me. That's my close-up. I like the fact that they shot a close-up of me. Everyone who was black was in that film. I was 16 at the time, and it struck me. My God, we're all here together. They could take us away without anyone noticing. And that thought weighed very heavily on me. Thank God that never came to pass. We were too few in number to matter to the Nazis. And I avoided all contact with white women. That would have been horrible. I would have been sterilized. And I might also have been charged with racial defilement.
You say that you took great care not to get too close to white women or girls. Was it like hiding or trying to become invisible? How can we imagine that?
Well, that's the right word. Invisible. Of course, with a face like this, I could never completely disappear. But I tried. I really did. The main thing was to keep your head down and your mouth shut. I made sure I did that.
Wow, this is some deep stuff. We're gonna, like I said, we're gonna do a document series on this. Every now and then, I'm gonna throw a docuseries in here about you know, blacks around the world who have integrated into their personal societies.
Understand why, as a child, I wanted to be white. Even if it takes a lot of strength and energy to deal with racism and to hold your head up high, I wouldn't want a different skin color, not for anything in the world.
The business, motherfucker. The Daily Read.